For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Choreographer, artist, curator, teacher, and editor Jay Parther joins me to discuss Restless Infections, Public Art, and a Transforming City. This collection of essays explores artistic interventions within urban spaces. To begin, could you tell us more about South Africa's largest and longest-running public art festival and explain the significance behind its name change from Infecting the City to Uninfecting the City?
The Infecting the City Public Art Festival began in 2007, and I think it was very much a Spear Estate initiative at the beginning because they were running a summer festival on the farm itself, on that big estate. And the thinking behind it was that they were getting an audience into this kind of enclave, and they wanted us to do something. At that time, it was Brett Bailey and myself to reimagine it as something that would benefit a wider range of people. And so this idea of a public art festival came about, and the name Infecting the City was we're always dealing with notions of disease and infection, and it's always quite close and precarious because we live in such an unequal society, and the majority of the people are constantly at risk of any kind of infection. So we wanted to turn that around a little bit, kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but also to talk to the lack of art that is available to majority of the people, because Cape Town is one of the art capitals of the world, but whether it is available to majority of the people of the country is arguable. And that's how the idea of infecting the city, but this time with art, became a kind of a joyful infection. And played with that etymology in that way. And over the years, it has moved from purely staging performances that would normally appear in a theatre or even in a gallery, but staging them in the public spaces. And it gave way to commissioning people to actually make work for particular spaces, as the whole idea of public art becomes more and more detailed and nuanced internationally. The Uninfecting the City that you picked up was actually for one edition, and that was during COVID. We didn't want to create a kind of a super spreader event with gathering lots of people close together, but we, of course, found that it was one of the safest ways to interact with theatrical performance, with performance of all kinds, and even to watch art installations in the city, because we were outside, you could move around and keep safe distances, etc. So we turned it around, again, playing with the irony of the infection, but also talking to how resilient artists are. Many artists changed a lot of their work and their submissions, and began to do work in shop windows. So there was that glass that helped to create a space of safety, and many artists also remade their work for the digital space. Some people created performances in their homes and then filmed that, and we screened films of that on the sides of buildings, etc. So it was an infection, but we were paying homage to the fact that so many of us were going through so much mental health issues, as well as physically succumbing to the pandemic. But it only lasted one edition, thankfully. We don't uninfect the city, we just go ahead and infect the city now.
Your book shifts the conversation around public art in South Africa, moving away from static, permanent forms to dynamic, temporary installations. Could you elaborate on this shift and provide a few examples?
South Africa's history of static public art, it's fairly prolific for a smallish country, but we're beleaguered with these colonial statues that remain. If you try to figure it out in relationship to the population that we have, there is an overabundance of those colonial statues that still remain. And then in order to ameliorate that, there have been quite a few public art commissions, notably in Johannesburg and to some extent in Cape Town, to a much smaller extent anywhere else in the country. If you think about one of the most obvious examples for a sculpture would be Nelson Mandela, right? And the most significant one is in a commercial center in Sandton, arguably one of the wealthiest square mile or something on the African continent. And I think that notion that here is a figure of such great importance, and the only notable sculpture we have a wonderful sculpture in Howick where he was arrested in northern KwaZulu-Natal. So yes, there are those. So the point was, if one thinks about it, why is it that we are struggling to find the quintessential emblem, which many other countries don't really struggle with? They know that this is what we are going to do. They commission an artist, and I think South Africa really struggles with permanent sculptures. And I was in a committee that was trying to find a work for Cape Town in Long Street, and it was quite a struggle. And it was really interesting. One of the works that didn't make it was a black fist, a massive black fist, which some of the commissioners felt was too violent, which is really strange and interesting, even though in our history it constitutes a symbol of power. And there was quite a sharp divide in the committee about what that meant. And it struck me then that the fabric of our society is not ready for the emblematic single symbol. And it made the idea of temporary installation, non-permanent work, all the more necessary. And that's why we talk about a transforming city, because Cape Town in particular is so unresolved. It's a very workable city, but it is unresolved in its topography, in its impossibility for people to travel, to get from one end to the other. What singular structure would keep everyone connected to the city and to nationhood, or whatever a sculpture is meant to do? And so the idea of temporary installations become quite important because they set up a discourse. And, we worked with an artist like Stembile Msizane, who she herself became a sculpture, and she stood on a plinth for like 8 hours in a performance in the company's gardens. And she's done this in various ways. And it signals that whatever she was representing, because in some respects she was sometimes wearing classical isiZulu, amabeshu, and, to what extent does that give purchase to everybody in the country? And you can imagine if we did a sculpture like that, ironically, if we did a sculpture of King Shaka in the middle of Tipple Square, I'm not quite sure how it would be received. And I think that our lack of sureness in terms of our history and what it actually means makes me understand why artists move naturally towards creating something that is more temporary, more discursive. Well, until we can get to that space, if we ever do get to that space where we all agree, but we don't agree, and that makes it much more difficult to get something up in concrete and mortar. And so the temporary installation allows us to hopefully mediate through it and come to some kind of idea.
During the COVID-19 lockdown, artists Mamela Meketha and Penny Siopis created powerful works addressing another devastating pandemic in South Africa, the alarming rise in gender-based violence. Please speak about these works and their impact.
The works reflect a wide range of other works by artists like Mamela and Nyamza that have tried to raise the issues around gender-based violence. One sculptor created 360 miniature sculptures that look like permanent ones, ironically, signifying the number of women and children that are killed daily right outside the Cape Town station. So the subject of gender-based violence is repetitive. It keeps coming on, and it is extremely devastating. It is tragic that it continues to come up. Mamela, of course, was looking at the post office around the murder of Nene, and this happened digitally during COVID. I think it is something that serves as both a reminder, but also about sustenance and witnessing. Probably one of the most devastating thing about the pandemic of gender-based violence is the lack of witness. I think that's the most crucial thing, is that I think that the level of silence and the level of we must go on continues to pervade our society. I think also that, we've come up with these catchphrases and these billboards, and I sometimes wonder how effective they are in serving as witness, because I'm not quite sure whether we have understood the conditions that give rise to it, and why it continues to pervade in our society, and why it continues to be unwitnessed. We keep talking about it, but there's a way of witnessing that we are not quite getting, and I think what Mamela and Penny, what they do is to work with a certain kind of subjectivity that allows us to enter without propagating a kind of victim consciousness, but really moving into what it is as a human to experience such violation and such violence. So I think they're just examples of what art, and in particular, what art by women artists who can create a subjectivity around it that is tangible and that can serve as a space for witnessing. And I think art does that exceptionally well, the way these two artists have shown.
Mbongeni Nchali's essay examines Ngulele Mazibukwe's Sacred Stone, a series of white stone temples installed across various public spaces in Cape Town. Could you explain the intention behind this work?
Ngulele's beautiful installation came up many years ago, and it references the Shembe movement. So the Shembe movement was a breakaway from traditional Christianity, and it started in northern KwaZulu-Natal. And the breakaway was because African people were not allowed to worship through singing or through dance. You had to be, you know, save a Christian and be, very puritanically Christian, like the way the white people liked it, and, in a very missionary languaging of it. So not only were they being forced out of their religious beliefs, but they were being forced out of their cultural beliefs. So that's a really interesting dichotomy, that not only were your religion being taken away from you, but even your desire to worship within your cultural frame was not allowed. So what the Shembe people did was they worshipped in all kinds of ways, in terms of their costume and in terms of the dance. And, they brought in a lot of indlamu and traditional dance into their worship. And most especially, they made their own temple. They got out of the church and they created these large circles of stones in urban spaces and in rural spaces. So they were these white stones, and they would worship within the parameters of that circle. And it's a really beautiful and so simple evocation of that resilience, and that resilience of being able to adapt to this idiotic kind of oppression, but not just idiotic. I don't want to reduce it. It must have been incredibly, and continues to be incredibly painful. So what the artist has done to reference that, she creates these circles of stones around the colonial sculptures, bringing us to that area of meditation and worship that the Shembe people asked of their followers, but a meditation of this retention of coloniality in our society. It's a really, really simple gesture, but so incredibly powerful, because it forces one to, as you've really wonderfully asked, about what is this, what is this background, that yeah, this is about referencing a move that happened in our history, but bringing it into our urban spaces so we keep connected with how people's spiritual beliefs and their cultural beliefs are implicated in this retention of colonial sculptures. And what Charlie does is, because his essay is talking about public art in a very interesting way, talking about it through the everyday, that how in our African society, the idea of public performance is not strange. We express in public spaces all the time, whether it is in a funeral, in a space of mourning, in spaces of protest, in spaces of social unrest. We're a very prolific public people. And I think the fact that that essay is in the first couple of essays of the book provides the landscape for how something like Infecting the City easily inserts itself into that way of experiencing art and experiencing each other in a public space. So he analyzes Olile's sculpture from that point of view.
Amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the Institute for Creative Arts, under your leadership, launched its first digital fellowships. This initiative aimed to support artists at a time when funding was scarce and the artistic practice was often deemed non-essential. Please share some of the works that emerged from this program.
During the pandemic, if we go back to that terrible time, one of the policies that came through governments, and this was not just our government, but throughout the world, by dispelling all kinds of activity, of engagement, was something that hit us quite badly, because in the previous question, I just spoke about how public and how integrated we are with each other in each other's spaces. There's a funny story with the Swiss when they relaxed the restrictions around COVID, and they were like, oh, do we really have to, uh, instead of being 5 meters away, do we have to go back to 3 meters away? But that's not South Africa. That's not us. We touch, we engage with each other. So when that happened, it really took everyone by shock. But I think that when it affected the theatrical milieu, the performing arts in particular, and inside theaters, when all of that was being affected, theaters were being closed down, and it really began to hurt not just the artists, but I think many of us were feeling that we are imagining theater and performance to just be entertainment, right? So we think of it as like going to a club, but from what we understand theatre and performance to be about, and even viewing art in a gallery, is about looking after one's mental health. It is about experiencing another reality, about going through a certain level of catharsis when you're watching something, about sharing that cathartic moment with someone next to you. So what it does for our mental health is massive. And when you also take that away, as if that is just about going to a club or going out dancing, then the short-sightedness of the restriction was quite daunting. Of course, the people that suffered the most were the artists, because not only were you taking away that facility to make visible, to talk and to inspire, but you also took away their livelihood, right? So ICA normally did some fellowships every year, which involved inviting artists to come onto the campus and to engage with each other, and very often coming up with a certain number of performances. And we couldn't do that. So the campuses were shut. We were outside the campus. So that's when this idea of how do we create a fellowship that will ask artists to engage with the works digitally. And the response was so massive. We were supposed to do only 18 fellows, and we ended up with 34 because we received about 340 applications, and majority of them were really good, were very demonstrative of a kind of investigation of what does this digital space actually mean. And I think that the most successful ones really experimented with how to turn this digital space into something that was tangible, and how to imbue it with an artistic quality that really drew an audience. So it wasn't just like about staging something and forming it, but how to create certain techniques with the digital medium, whether it is taking your cursor and being able to touch in different things and bringing up other kinds of imagery. I mean, the work that people did was super interesting in terms of how it managed to create that same kind or a similar kind of involvement. You can't really replace the theater, but they really tried to do that. And what we did was we got some digital advisors and people who were well versed in how to take the digital space and really turn it around and masticate and tease out its possibilities. So the call spoke to the fact that you could have been just an artist. You didn't need to have too much digital experience, but you had some intention of how you could transform your artwork, your performance into an experience that could live online. And there were many people who took a lot of chances, and it was very unpredictable because sometimes a digital artist would, got the fellowship, and we were expecting something from that person. But on the other hand, like a choreographer who just was playing around revealed a lot more. And I think, a new language was created. And that language has stayed to some extent in terms of the kinds of work that artists produced. I must say, I really looked forward to the showings. It was really beautiful to have those moments because when we had those discussions afterwards, the screen was flooded with people who were wanting to engage, and one could understand why at that time. So, yeah, it was a really beautiful moment for the Institute for Creative Arts.
Public art often carries tensions and unpredictability. Can you discuss this using Donna Kokama's The Swing as an example?
Thank you for that example of Donna Kokama's swing work because it is such an early work that really inserts itself into an urban space with great courage. Because, these days, if you do a work like that, you'll need security. And, you right now with Infecting the City as well, we have an ambulance that follows us and medical professionals and people that work with the traffic. And, it's a whole performance of security on its side to the actual work. But so in the time of Donna's swing, there was no such thing, and I think it's really interesting because I mean, look, the unpredictability still stays, and I think this idea of throwing this money and expecting it to kind of just be this beautiful waterfall of things until it becomes pretty nasty just reveals something very profound about public art, that it is so uncontrollable that the results you can't manufacture them the way you can in the theater because of those controlled circumstances. There were so many instances of that in the earlier days of Infecting the City, and up to now, where at the very quiet moment in a dance piece, a member of the audience will walk past right in the middle of the space with their shopping bags, and you could never do that on stage, and yet it would be so profound and so perfect and beautiful in terms of what it does. And that tension and that unpredictability is what I think a lot of public art actually strives for. To some extent, I guess maybe we have become overconscious of safety, and the accent on safety really drains everything out to the point where I'm not quite sure whether the work is allowed to breathe anymore. And I think we're learning how to complement maintaining what you're calling the tension and the unpredictability while ensuring a level of safety. There was another work by Celo Pesa where one of his dancers rolled in the traffic. And even when there were no cars coming, the tension with the audience and that kind of application became so profound. And it was just interesting, the discussions that came afterwards where people were questioning the responsibility of the artist to do that. And so one could question the responsibility of the artist, of Donna Kukama, and the money in a space of great abjection. There was another artist who was cutting up pieces of meat in the middle of Cape Town in the parade and referencing the idea of hunger, but it just turned out into a bun fight because you can imagine the homeless people there were just interested in the meat, exactly what the artist was attempting to do as a comment, but the reality overtook the artistic gesture. I think that is quite successful about art because it pushes us into a realm of reality that we often would like not to see. So we pretend like it doesn't exist. We scroll past images of starving children in Gaza, and we watch people in our own cities who are living exactly those lives, those kind of precarious lives, and we try to ignore that. And what the artist simply does is to bring our attention closer to that. So this unpredictability and these tensions is something that temporary art really can play with, because one can adjust to those circumstances really, really quickly. And it doesn't become a one-liner. It embraces the complexities of our unequal society and our transforming society in really brilliant ways. And I think in many respects, it also stays with the audience much longer.
Please also tell us about Haroon Gansali's sculpture, Crying for Justice, which is integrated into the landscape in Cape Town. The work invites the public to walk among unmarked graves, reflecting the lives and unresolved deaths of victims of apartheid-era security police violence.
Haroon's amazing, extraordinary, very authoritative work was the digging up of these multiple graves, but it was not in any space, it was at the Cape Town fort. And that was quite significant because the fort represents, in many respects, the bastion of coloniality. And to have, first of all, received this kind of permission to do that in order to create it. I mean, that's another interesting thing about public artists, how you have to work as a kind of a negotiator and a shapeshifter and kind of talking through to people. I mean, for the authorities at the Cape Town Castle and the fort to actually relent and allow him to dig up these graves right around the castle must have taken a great deal of negotiation. But I really think that very often people think of artists as, someone will just come in and they've got the luxury to just do something. But there is just so much of negotiating and trying to figure things out, especially when you're trying to create that kind of opposition and that kind of irony that brings your eye to it. And that really, you go, oh, yeah, these are graves not just in an open expanse of land. This is right at the castle. So what, of course, he is referencing is how historically, I don't think we have even begun to understand how much death we have not acknowledged and we have not brought into our memory and brought into our world. And I think most especially something like this being in Africa, where the notion of time is quite different, I think, to what one might find in Europe or the United States of America, especially, I'm not talking about the First Nations people in the United States, but at this moment where time is, the past and the present and the future, whereas on the African continent in various cultures, the past is implicated in the present and implicated in the future. So the past and the future become one thing. And the past is not just something that is done with. The past, philosophically, it stays with us. And it is a concept that I don't think we have quite understood in terms of how it affects majority of the people psychically. One often hears coming from people that are not part of these cultures that, just get over it, just move on. Why don't you just move on? Thinking of the past as something that is done. And it's not just even about trying to remind people about what has happened. It is philosophically, it is at odds with how one lives, where majority of our people in the country live with the notion of ancestors and live with the notion that what has supposedly been behind us is very present. So unrecognized death is an in-present thing. And I think what Haroon does is bring our attention to the fact that this kind of lack of resolution sets up kind of a psychic distension in our country. There is also a relationship between that level of undisclosed violence and the violence that continues to happen in Cape Town, for example, or in other parts of South Africa. That, there's something about that psychic instability that still remains unresolved.
Finally, could you share insights from your conversations with choreographer Nora Chipamire, visual artist Thanya Peterson, and theatre maker Mandla Mabothwe, and offer a glimpse into their perspectives within the context of a restless, ever-changing city?
when I was trying to figure out how to conclude such a diverse collection of essays, I thought it would be best to give the voice over to artists. I mean, all three of them are also writers. I thought that a conversation with them around some of the themes that came out, which is about the city, about public and audiences, and about home. And what all three artists in their responses come back to is this constant restlessness and the fact that the rest doesn't come easily because the African city, and certainly the African city and South Africa, is a barometer of what is going on in the nation. And that the lack of equality in Cape Town, the terrible topography that we still have, the impossibility for Black people to move in and out of the city because of the issues around transport that shockingly in the 21st century remain unresolved. The supreme lack of housing for people closer to the city, and the giving off of land and property to foreign investors and digital nomads, all of those elements that make Cape Town such a shocking space, actually, because the beauty of it, the functionality of it, as our erstwhile Helen Ziller will attest, is the functionality is all that we want to acknowledge. Its dysfunction is something that we continue to invisibilize. And that is something that all three artists reference, is that it's not just the dysfunction that affects most of Cape Town City, but it's a dysfunction that continues to be invisible. And as Mandla Mbatwa talks about, how to turn that unforgiving concrete in the middle of the city into something that is more liquid, that is more generous, that is more human. And to take away this notion that enclave that we have created in the center of Cape Town is not enough to heal and to hold all of the city's inhabitants. And that tension then that comes with this lack of resolution for all the peoples of the country continues to stay in these artists' minds as they create works. And it was interesting, Tanya Peterson's work called Taxi, where she made artworks on the taxi and a video installation inside. And then again, like we were talking about the collaboration with Arun Gansali, but with Tanya, speaking to taxi owners and drivers and going into that whole milieu and negotiating with them about how she could change the look of that taxi so that thousands of people experience her art every single day. But at the same time, she references that that's just one artist doing that, yeah, but she references the sheer lack of that kind of humanity and care that plagues Cape Town, and at once makes us top of the New York Times' best city list, but also gives us the title of the murder capital of the world. So how does an artist, how do curators, educators hold that dichotomy together? All three artists are very outspoken, as you can tell from their responses, but they're still trying. And I think we should thank the universe for that we have artists like that are still trying to find metaphor, to find symbol. They are really, really trying to find a language to articulate this distinction. And my sense is that we will get to a tipping point when we won't be able to, because it would be too much and too long. And the fact that these artists do that is at once nice that artists do that, but I hope it comes across as words of urgency, that looking away from these distensions inside of our city that the artists are bringing our attention to won't also be invisible. And then, the capitulation into something far more impossible will be very hard to pull us all back from. So from that point of view, public artists who go into this urban fabric and are able to look at it with the honesty and the clarity and the directness as they would with making an artwork in for a gallery or inside a theater, to be able to take that degree of honesty into a public space that is unpredictable takes a great deal of immense courage. And I think that these artists epitomize that and show us how lucky we are to have artists who do that in our increasingly problematic and stuttering transforming city.
That was Jay Parther discussing his book, Restless Infections, Public Art and a Transforming City. Visit the Polity website to access other author interviews and news and information updates. If you haven't already done it, subscribe to Polity's email services so you can continue to be informed of developments.